There really is just too much to talk about with this play. We're going to do something a little bit different this time around. This lecture today will be mostly about the background of this play and really the next few, and sketch out a bit about what Shakespeare is doing in this different genre. We're done with comedies now, by the way. Henry IV Parts 1 and 2, Henry V, and Richard III are all history plays. Now, as a genre, histories are way less formulaic. There's no conventional hero or beloved or clever servant character types. There are no generic settings or trope-heavy plot structures. Really, the only convention is that the play is based on history. Because of that, it actually has a lot of variability. We find comic characters, tragic characters, classical settings, supernatural, mythological overtones. Because the mode of storytelling isn't confined by its conventions, it imports conventions from all over the spectrum. And now it's no small wonder that history plays were one of the most popular genres in the late Elizabethan period, kind of like the superhero movie of the day. There are a couple of key sources Shakespeare is drawing from. The first, maybe most important, would be popular contemporary historical research. A book called Holinshed's Chronicles is the main source for a ton of Shakespeare's works, even things we don't really think of as histories like Macbeth or King Lear. Holinshed is actually written by a group of several scholars, not just Raphael Holinshed, who it's named for. Some of these authors are strict Protestants, some are nominal cultural Protestants, some are crypto-Catholics, some are outright Catholics. This diversity of perspectives makes the book notably nuanced for the way it navigates the shifting political theology and religious attitudes that shaped England at this time. Still, Shakespeare's not just adapting Holinshed for the stage. There are lots of other bits and pieces that make their way into these plays, and some stuff he just makes up for better storytelling. Two notable examples in Henry IV Part 1. Hotspur, Henry Percy, is actually about 25 years older than Hal at the Battle of Shrewsbury. Hal would have only been about 16 then in real life, and the two didn't square off in single combat. Hotspur did die in that battle. Dude took an arrow to the face when he took his helmet off. But Shakespeare took some liberties here with the ages so that Hotspur and Hal could be appropriate parallels. Foil is the literary term. Hotspur, it seems, has all the qualities we might assume a king should have. Strength, nobility, prowess, power. And Hal, it seems, has some bad qualities. He's flippant, wanton, unruly. And it just makes sense to make the two Henrys, Percy and Plantagenet, mirror each other from a literary or artistic perspective. Another example is Falstaff, perennial audience favorite. Falstaff is an invention. Dude did not really exist, but he was based loosely on another historical figure, Sir John Oldcastle. The problem is, by Shakespeare's time, the Oldcastle family had considerable power, and didn't really take kindly to having their ancestor played as a drunken buffoon. All that is to say, what makes a history is that it's based on history. But not really, not slavishly, I mean. Shakespeare is using these very popular historical sources to make a series of plays in a very popular genre. Folks in his audience would have known the stories well, or would have at least known the basics. It's really not all that different from our own historical fiction of today. We know at least the basics of things like World War II just through cultural osmosis. So what would help us is to get that basic story in the frame. Then we can better see what liberties Shakespeare is taking, and from there, we can see how and why those liberties make sense to an Elizabethan audience. Hopefully in all of this, we'll start to get a sense, too, of how history is not merely a static object we look at, like the geological record. It's a living, shifting thing, always redirected and redeployed towards the moment, not of its inception, but of its writing. History, really, is never about the past. It's always about the present. By way of preface, there are three ruling ideas that will help us make sense of what's happening here, and they're all connected. The first is an ontological idea called the Great Chain of Being. The second is a political theology called the Divine Right of Kings, and the third is a social structure known as primogeniture. The Great Chain of Being organized all the cosmos along a hierarchy according to what had more or less being. There's some Neoplatonic ideas in the background here. The medievals believed that everything in creation only existed as long as it participated in one of 5 transcendental forms: goodness, truth, beauty, oneness, and being. Now, you'll never out there in the world encounter any one of these things in its own entirely. So oneness, for example, the concept of something that is one thing. That flower is one flower, but it's actually made up of many petals, and those petals are made up of many veins and so on. I have one body, but it's made up of arms and legs and stuff, and those are made up of skin and muscle and bones, and those are made up of cells, and those are made up of molecules, atoms, particles. So anytime I find one thing, it's not actually one thing, but many things all stuck together. Now, the only exception here is the divine. God alone is one, is good, beautiful, so on. So for being, then, it follows that God has being, and everything has the same kind of being, just to a lesser degree. The great chain of being was a way of organizing this list of who had more being and who had less. So God's got all the being. Angels, since they're created entities, have less being than God, but since they don't have material bodies, they have more being than humans. Humans have material bodies, which are always dying, but also have a rational soul, so they end up someplace between angels and animals. By the way, people of the Tudor period were notoriously cruel to animals. Some of the most popular pastimes were blood fights between captured bears or dogs. Animals were basically just living rocks. And that was the bottom of the chain. Rocks and minerals. It's stuff, it's material, but it doesn't do anything. So from this, we can also zero in on any one section and see the hierarchy repeated again. There are archangels, there are messenger angels, there are guardian angels. There are animals you can train, animals you can eat, and animals like insects and stuff. They're basically plants. So too with humans. The great chain of being became a model for social hierarchies. Nobility near the top, poor at the bottom, and kind of half step between each women of those classes. We saw something like this with Taming of the Shrew. Kate's proper place in the hierarchy is submitting to her husband and dominating her servants. At the top of all of this, of course, was the king, God's special anointed leader and representative of divine authority on earth. So you can see how easily this ontological hierarchy leads into a political theology. The divine right of kings was simply the idea that if someone is the king, then they are put there by God himself and are not to be questioned or trifled with. To mess with the king is not just to question authority in an abstract sense, it's literally to question the entire order of the cosmos, a challenge to God himself. This will become a sticking point in how people will justify rebellion, which is really the starting point of Henry IV. All said, the king is the king because God has authorized him to be the king, and submission to his rule is synonymous with submission to God. This also starts to explain why the firstborn son had such a high place as well. The firstborn son followed very closely in the great chain of being. They were destined by the divine order of the cosmos to take their rightful place as the next ring in the great chain. For the son of a king, that meant they had something like a mantle of divine right to rule placed over them. This kind of works two ways. On the one hand, the king was the king, whoever he was, and nobility and commoners alike owed him allegiance. On the other hand, the king would need to refine his character to match the expectation of what a good king should be. For a new prince, that meant a mix of training, behavioral performance, kind of natural aptitude for virtuous leadership. It's a tall order and a lot of pressure. The future stability of the entire universe depended on your ability to play that role. These principles had done a lot to shape English history, but by Shakespeare's time they were starting to lose relevance. The Reformation, with its emphasis on deconstructing the priesthood, also threatened the great chain of being. If all are equal before God, then this hierarchy doesn't really work. This set the stage for the new humanism of the Enlightenment era that would find radically different terms for a social structure, like inalienable rights or autonomy. The divine right, too, would face a significant challenge just 50 years later, when King Charles I is found guilty of treason and executed. Had it coming too. Dude raised taxes. What was he even thinking? Even after the monarchy is restored a decade later, kings and queens didn't take the same level of privileges. There would never be another Henry-type figure. Primogeniture was maybe the most stubborn, because this system was so wedded to patriarchy, and patriarchy is a pernicious weed that pops up under different mutations in every generation. First sons would be important for the English gentry well into the 19th century, but shifting economic realities made it far more possible for someone to make their own way as a clergyman, in the military, or even an upstart merchant, like Shakespeare himself. Something to keep in mind while we look at the follies and foibles of nobility and kings, this was a world beginning to fade from everyday experience. Okay, with all that in view, we're ready to start unpacking the situation. Shakespeare's histories can especially be difficult because they assume you already know all this stuff. They also use characters' names interchangeably with their title or place of birth. So Henry, the place title, is Henry Plantagenet. That's his last name. He's King Henry, that's his title. And he's Henry Bolingbroke, because he was born in Bolingbroke Castle. So Prince Hal, then, his son, is Prince Henry, or his nickname, Harry or Hal. His title, the Prince of Wales. His family name, Henry Plantagenet. Or his birthplace, Henry Monmouth. That's all the same dude. And Shakespeare's audience would already be familiar with these titles. It's harder for us to follow sometimes. Keep an eye on the cast list if you're getting confused by who's what. It doesn't help that everyone's named Henry or William or Edward or Richard either. Alright, so why is everyone mad at each other? Why is the king in trouble? Who cares if Hal likes to party with his buddy? And what's so bad about Hotspur? Let's go back in time about 200 years to set the stage. This all starts with Henry II. Henry is the first king of the Plantagenet line. He takes the throne from his second cousin Stephen, who's kind of a disaster of a king. Now at this time, England is more or less a province of France. Most of what happens with these dudes is tied to French politics. Henry's rule is pretty unstable. Lots of family drama. Before ascending to the throne, Henry marries Eleanor of Aquitaine. At the time, she was the wife of the French king. Later, he takes as mistress the woman betrothed to his son Richard, which is also the daughter of the French king. It's a mess. The son of the King of France spurs Henry's sons toward rebellion. Three of them, Geoffrey, young Henry, and Richard, with the queen, their mom, Eleanor, launch an unsuccessful rebellion. Young Henry dies of a fever, leaving Richard, the second son, as the heir. Richard ends up overthrowing his father and claiming the throne. He's later known as Richard the Lionheart. If you know the Robin Hood legends, this name is familiar. Richard loves fighting, can't get enough crusading. In fact, dude never really takes up residence in England at all. He didn't even speak English. Richard doesn't produce any heirs. In fact, some historians think it's likely Richard was actually gay or maybe bisexual. Anyways, Richard is hardly ever home and uses England as more of a bank of resources for his crusades and wars in France. Still, the people love him. He becomes the model of a pious and noble warrior king. Still kind of is in a lot of legends. After he dies without leaving a son, the throne reverts to his brother John. Remember, primogeniture. The rightful heir to the throne must be the nearest, oldest son. Richard's line is dead, so it goes back to Henry II's roster, and now we get third son John. Again, if you know Robin Hood, this is Prince John. Not as slimy as legends make him out to be, but not great either. Under John, the kings of England lose their holdings in France. Having no land to fight over there, they have no choice but to develop their own country, England. Here, though, John runs afoul of the English nobles. There's a bit of a tussle, but instead of overthrow, the nobles force John into a compromise, the Magna Carta. It's a foundational document in civil law that begins to outline the idea of rights, really important for the formation of democracies later in history. Now this exposes a major hole in the whole divine right, great chain of being stuff. To say the king rules England is really to say the king holds together a federation of very powerful lords and landowners, barons, dukes, bishops, who agree it's in their best interest to unite under a single ruler. If at any point they all decide it's no longer in their best interest, then the king's in trouble. See, it's like this. Power comes from owning land. If you have land, you have access to resources, which you can barter or sell for mercenaries, and people, which you can tax to enlist into an army. That means the king on his own really is only as strong as the alliances he makes with other English nobles. The game of English politics is really about keeping the nobles happy, and divine right kind of just helps smooth over the bumps in the road. So John has two sons. His older son Henry takes the throne at age 9, becoming Henry III. Henry's reign is pretty stable, more importantly, lasts a really long time. This is one of the longest ruling monarchs in English history. England makes some inroads into Wales, the western part of the island, and has more control in Ireland. Next, Henry III's firstborn son, Edward, becomes king. He's also known as Edward Longshanks, because he's tall. He's about 6'3", average height was 5'5" at the time. He's also called the Hammer of the Scots, because he beat the hell out of Scotland. If you've seen the movie Braveheart, this is that dude. Edward makes both Scotland and Wales officially under English control. Longshanks has 1 million kids. From his first marriage, 3 of the oldest sons all die before they can inherit the throne, so it eventually goes to fourth-born son Edward II. Ed too is mostly unremarkable. He's not a very strong king. He's eventually forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his firstborn son, Edward III. Now this guy is legit. He's a powerful king at home and abroad. He gets all the nobles in line. He ushers in a time of peace and prosperity. And importantly, the guy is king forever, like 50 years. This leads us up to the present for Henry IV Part 1. Edward has 5 sons. The firstborn is the awesomely named Edward the Black Prince. But the Black Prince dies in battle before he can become king. So, question, who's next in line for the throne? Should it go to the prince's firstborn son, Richard, or to King Edward's second son, John of Gaunt? The great chain of being is unclear on this point. Really, both of them seem to have a strong claim. Now, here's where this facade of the divine right begins to break down. Richard, the king's grandson, it seems, should be the inheritor, but he's just an infant. So John of Gaunt, second, now eldest son of the king, steps in as Lord Protector, ruling the country until Richard comes of age. Now, here's the problem. Richard is just the worst. He's flighty, dandyish, a real popinjay if you know what I mean. He makes all the wrong friends and alienates all the wrong people. One of those people is John of Gaunt, actually. When John died, the king effectively seized all his land and therefore stole power from John's son, young Henry, aka Henry Bolingbroke. This is mostly a political move. A lot of powerful nobles didn't like Richard, but all that divine right nonsense builds from the structure of the entire cosmos, and it's something ultimately their own power is based on too. To deny Richard's right to rule would undermine their own authority. Now, if there were only some other person with an equal claim to the throne, then Richard could be easily swapped out, the divine right, great chain, primogeniture, all that stuff, untouched. Richard knows this, and he knows that Henry Bolingbroke is the most likely candidate now that John of Gaunt is dead. Best thing to do is keep Henry out of England and make sure he can't rally any more support. This backfires catastrophically. The nobles, guys like Westmoreland, Mortimer, Worcester, Northumberland, all back Henry Bolingbroke, bring him safely back into England. They place him on the throne and toss Richard into prison. But this leaves a problem for Henry, now King Henry IV. He's king, sure, but the other king, Richard, is still alive. Dude starts having an existential crisis. Can there be two divinely anointed kings? Is there room in the great chain of being for twinsies? Which one of us really is the king in God's eyes? Man, this would all be a lot easier if Richard was just dead instead of in prison. Well, one of Henry's people overhears the king hashing all this out and misunderstands it as a command, go kill Richard, which he does. But look, listen, that doesn't solve the king's problem. If Richard really had been God's anointed king, now Henry's in some serious shit. He's not just a pretender, he's a regicide. He's got to make sure, for the sake of his immortal soul, that he really was supposed to be king, because if he's not, he can just as easily be deposed and replaced. The real sign will be this: Henry is the rightful king if his line is also right for the throne. And then we get his son Hal, madcap Prince of Wales, cavorting with scoundrels, drinking his life away, robbing people in the streets just for fun. This guy looks nothing like a future king, and everyone knows it. Meanwhile, the nobles that installed Henry are starting to get a bit miffed at him. They think he's not living up to the promises he made them. I mean, that's really to say they're upset they can't control him. So Henry's got a crisis of authenticity to deal with, a dangerous group of angry nobles on his back, and his son so disappointing he threatens to unravel Henry's whole reason for existence. So that's where we begin. It sets the scene, sure, but it leaves us with a lot still to explore in this text. Remember, Shakespeare's not in the business of education. He's an entertainer. This play isn't meant to give us a history lesson. It's meant to give us a feeling. And it uses history as the vehicle to bring that feeling about. There's just so much more to unpack here. What does this play say about the difference between appearance and reality? And what role does that play in the overall structure of the divinely authorized kingly authority? Is a person more than what they seem to be? Or are our social performances the only thing that give us substance? What about honor? Is that a real thing? A thing we win? A thing we're born with? What's the role of a good father? We've seen some examples of bad fathers, but what should a good father do? How loyal should we be to our friends? What about when our friends make us worse people? Then we still have those much bigger questions to explore. Why this history at this time? What's all this got to do with aging heirless Elizabeth in Shakespeare's time of shifting cultural paradigms, new identity positions, and dying institutions? Why again at this time, right now? Whenever a history play gets trotted out on stage, it's done so to address the very real issues of the culture it's performed for. It should be no surprise that this cycle of plays, with all its emphasis on civil disorder, honorable rule, God's providence, was really popular in the US just before the Civil War. It should be no surprise, too, that this cycle of plays, with its revisionist history, its nationalist and nationalizing tendencies, was part of a massive cultural campaign in the UK just a few years ago, anticipating Brexit and the rise of English nationalism. What might we, as Biden-era US subjects, so shaken as we are, so wan with care, make of this story of a young man forced into a role of leadership to pay a debt he never promised, torn between social expectations of honor and performance and the carefree illusions of the endless summer of youth? Now, please don't misunderstand me. History gives us no solutions. It only gives us the raw data. It's what we do with that data that matters.